Hi and welcome to the Thinkin' Spot. I'm sorry it's been so long since I've been able to share a video with you, but I'm back today and I promised that I would share a technique that I learned at a class I took, and that's what I want to share with you today. So this technique is a great technique to use when you've got an image to color that has a lot of pattern in it and you want to give it a three-dimensional look without actually having to color each and every little detail in the pattern. This is a faster and easier way to add dimension to your image without spending a lot of time. This particular image that we're working with today is the sheep stamp, and this comes to us from the Scrappin' Cottage. This is one of their Cottage Impressions cling mount stamps. They are a deeply etched rubber stamp with the cling foam that you mount to an acrylic block. This was stamped with Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I'm going to color it with my Copics. And what I'm going to do is start with an E40, which is a brick white, and I want to give the curls in the sheep's wool a three-dimensional look. But as you can see, those are really tiny and there's a lot of pattern in the background there. So what I'm going to do is start by coloring the entire area, which I did already, with an E40 brick white Copic marker. And I'm just going to give everything a background color in a very, very light color. And then in order to make some of the curls in the sheep's wool pop and look dimensional, what I'm going to do is start filling in between with a darker color. So I went from an E40 to an E42, and you can see I'm leaving the little curly cues out, which if I hadn't learned this technique, I probably would have tried to highlight each one of those, or shade each one of those little curls in the sheep's wool. But this way I'm just going right in between with the darker color. And with this second color, I'm really just kind of filling in pretty solid between those little curls. Okay, and you can start to see that immediately pops it up a little bit. You start to see the lighter, and as the ink dries, it will pop even more. So I'm moving on up. Normally I leave 3 numbers between each color that I'm using, but with this E series in particular, I find there's enough variation, enough subtle variation that I can get away with it. So I moved from a 42 to a 43, and this time I'm not going to fill in solid. I'm going to fill in here and there. And you can see immediately that starts adding even more dimension. And I'm looking for the areas where I see the curls in that fur really close together. Okay, and as you can see, that really pops it out a little more. I think I see in the center there I need a little more dimension. I'm not doing it quite as solid this time. And then I'm going to go one more. I'm going to move up to an E44. And I'm just going to get some of the corners. Don't want to fill it in quite as solid with the darker colors. Just here and there. Because the thing about getting dimension in your projects is the more area, the more space you can get between your darkest and lightest color is going to give it the most dimension or make it stand out the most. Looks pretty good. I think we need a little bit more in some of the corners right here in the middle. Okay. Now, as I often do, I'm going to start working backwards then from my darkest back down to my lightest, and I'm just going to go blend out any of the harsh edges that I see haven't already blended or melted into the previous color. And one thing I want to mention, I've had people ask me before, that's very, very, very important, and the very first thing you've got to consider when you're working with Copic markers is your paper choice. The very best paper, my favorite paper to use, and that's what I'm using today, is the paper that Copic introduced last summer at CHA. It's the Express It blending card. It is the best paper I've used to achieve really great blending with your Copics. I also have a lot of success with the Nina Classic Solar White, and I started out using Georgia Pacific paper just because it was what was readily available to me, and I get along okay with it, although it isn't one I'd recommend when you're just starting out. But it's very, very important to start out with good paper if you want to be happy with the results you get with your Copic markers. And those are my top 3 picks as far as paper goes, but definitely the Express It blending card is the best I've found. It is pricey, and I save it and I use it just for coloring my Copic images. I don't use it as a base for a card or anything like that. So very, very important when you're using your Copics. So I'll continue to go backwards here from my 44 down to 43 and then a 42. And then a 41. And I don't think I got the 41 in there the first time because it's very, very close to the 42. But as I'm going back through and blending this out and blending it together. Okay, and I'm happy with where this is going, but you can see there's still some areas there that are pretty dark, but I'm going to lighten those up as I go back through. I'm going to go back to my E40, which is the very first color I used to start with. I'm going to change to the chisel tip, and I'm going to go over everything. And with this particular number ending in a 0, that tells me that there's a lot of the blender, the Copic blending solution, in this particular marker. So it's going to lighten up everything. And you'll notice that while that paper's wet, your entire image is going to look pretty dark. But as it dries, your lightest areas will just pop out and away from those darker ones. Okay, now you can see I've got the entire area covered with the E40 so that I can blend everything back together. And now I'm going to take my colorless blender, and I'm going to use the brush tip, and I'm just going to go through and on some of these individual little curls, I'm going to use my blender to kind of push that color out of there. I'm going to do all of them. I just want a few of them to kind of pop out. So you always remember that your blender is an eraser. It's not an actual blender pen. I'm not trying to blend. What I want to do is make these pop. And coloring them, they automatically get darker, but as they dry, you'll definitely see those pop and stand out. And that's what we want. Okay. I'll let that dry, and we should be right where we want as far as this little guy goes. Now you can see I went ahead and I based the legs and the face and the ear and the tail of the sheep in with a C3 Copic marker. And I'm going to move up. I'll go ahead and show you quickly how to shade those areas. I'm going to move up to the C5. C1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 I use a lot, most all the time when I'm shading black or want to color black. These are the colors that I use, and I use them all. I'm going to keep all my shading on one side and do the feather blending technique in just a tiny area. It's kind of hard to do sometimes when you're working in a tiny area. And I'm going to keep my shading on this side as well. The sheep. I want to be able to see some good variation there. Same with the ear. My light source is going to be coming from the top right down. Okay, and you can see how I did that, and I'm going to go ahead and use the same technique with the C7 and C9, not pulling the color out quite as far out for each one of them. Okay, you can see here where I have finished this image up. You can see where it's starting, the color starting to dry, and you can really see the variation in the fur on the sheep or the wool on the sheep. And I finished the sheep's legs. I started with C3 and shaded with C5, 7, and 9, and then I went back and blended those all together with the simple feather blending technique, keeping most of the C9 on the hooves because I wanted those to be the darkest part. And now this is ready for a little bit of highlighting with a white gel pen and be put on a card. And here's my finished card. This one is, I used some pattern paper that reminded me of Rolling Green Hills, and I did the little thank you, which comes from the Cottage Impressions Farm Phrases stamp set, and the I Miss You would have been a good one too, but I used the thank you. I used a little decorative clip there to hold the sentiment to the piece of ribbon that matches the paper. And I hope you enjoy it. I want to thank you for stopping by. Have a wonderful day and happy stamping.